Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to SafeDefend Live. I'm Dave Evans with the Doc Vecchi, the master of all things EPI and people with messed up minds. So just kidding. With people that have destroyed all this stuff. But I think a little joke. This is serious stuff today. We're going to talk today about how to conduct a vulnerability assessment when you have known offenders. One of the things we've got to do to protect ourselves is understand how these people think, what they do, and how to understand if they were a threat to our organization or not. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our behavioral science genius, Dr. Vecchi.
Well, no pressure there. How you doing, Dave? Good to be here with you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've been talking a little bit about this. We've talked before about risk versus threat and how people get that mixed up and things like this. And then people talk about vulnerability. And I wanted to kind of think about, when you're talking about security. Now, this also applies not to just schools, right? This is any area where you need to protect from a vulnerability from any sort of a potential targeted violence attack. So workplaces, schools are typically what we talk about, but any place like that. So I don't want to limit it to just one type of location. And so when you're thinking of prevention, right, what things that come up is we've been obviously focused almost entirely on threat assessment. And that's important. That's when you have someone who is on your radar, who is exhibiting some sort of concerning behavior, and then you do the threat assessment. Okay, so that's the main thing we've talked about. But there's also risk and vulnerability assessment, as well as mitigation things you can do. And the mitigation things you can do is a lot of times it's the physical security stuff, like having locks on the doors and metal detectors and whatever you're going to do, right? So kind of that sweet spot in the middle is looking at risk and vulnerability. And that's vulnerability is really based on the probability that something's going to happen, something bad's going to happen. And we see this a lot in foreseeability. You'll have companies, workplaces, schools, and insurance, and you get lawsuits because there's something was happening, you didn't do it, it wasn't reasonable, it was foreseeable that this bad thing was going to happen. So it kind of comes from that standpoint, but just adding a little bit more to it based on understanding behavior and types of violence. So when you're trying to decide on your security budget, where do you want to put your money for risk and vulnerability assessment? You got to pick your category, right? So in this case, we're going to be talking about some sort of targeted violence, right? Typically we think of active shooter, active killer attacks, but something like that. But within that, you've actually got three possibilities or three probabilities, I guess, right? The first one is type 1, which is a stranger attack, right? Someone that's not associated with the school or workplace, whatever the location you're trying to protect. And they're not a customer, they're not an employee, they're not a student, whatever. Someone that's completely a stranger. That's type 1. Type 2 is for certain businesses, certain facilities and things that have clients, patients, customers, things like that. And they're the ones that are violent, right? Type 3 is what we talk a lot about, especially in schools. And that's your current and former students, right? And we know that that's about a 91% chance, typically. If you're talking about workplaces, it's nearly 80% chance it's going to be a current or former employee. And so that's type 3. And then the last one, I just consider it kind of spillover violence. Spillover violence would be people associated with people at that location, like the angry father who comes to school, becomes violent, or the person, the spouse is coming to do domestic violence against their girlfriend or wife or something at the location, and they bring the violence. So those are the things that we have to kind of start with that most people don't think about. Okay, what type of violence? And then what we have to do is tie that to your offender, right? And you got to understand that these offenders are not, they're not defending themselves from being attacked. These are predators, and they typically have got four different motivations or major motivations. Number one is that it's resource, right? They're doing it for a reason, like stealing money or something of value, right? So you got your resource predator. You also have your process predator. This is your psychopathic serial killer that just does it because he likes it, right? And then that's a possibility, right? And then you have the grievance predator, right? And that's what we almost always have here when we're talking about school and workplaces, because again, 90% is going to be a current or former student that has some sort of a grievance, rather that's feeling wrong, bullied, maybe it's ideological or whatever, right? And so those are your 4 areas of violence and your 4 types of offenders. And then essentially what we're doing is when you do your vulnerability assessment, or your risk and vulnerability, we have to look at it by where are we at in the risks for these types of violence, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Is it stranger, customer, a student, employee, or someone that's associated with them? And then what we want to do is we have to determine, okay, ideally at the end of the day, we want to understand who might be the attacker, who may attack, why would they attack, where would they attack, what would they use to attack, and how would they carry it out, right? And when you're trying to figure it out and asking those questions, again, you're thinking from a standpoint of security, of a budget, putting your money where the most likely problem is, because everybody's budget obviously is limited. We basically break it down from there to assets, areas, times, what specific vulnerabilities are, and then routes to be taken if it were be an attack, like how would they approach, where would they approach from, then the motivation and method of attack. And so essentially, in a nutshell, what we're doing is first and foremost, you're trying to determine what is your most likely type of targeted violence. And that's where you're going to put the most of your effort and vulnerability. So let's say you're a company who is like a bank, right? Well, your likely type of targeted violence is probably going to be type 1, stranger, someone who's not associated with it, the bank robber, right? And there's very different things you would do for that type of violence than you would for a kid who's being bullied, who's supposed to be there, right? And so, so you wouldn't, for a kid who might be become violent because of a grievance, you certainly don't want to focus on perimeter security, right? Or things like that, because they're supposed to be there. And so it's really just a simple thing of laying out what assets do you want to protect, the types of people, groups of people, the types of buildings, what areas specifically, classrooms, common areas, the parking lot, maybe the yard or something around the building. And then what times, times, right? Maybe it's the beginning of the day, end of the day, evening, middle of the night, or special event type stuff, right? And then you look at your physical security, right? Your cameras, your other stuff, and ask the question, are these the right things for what I'm likely to encounter in terms of probabilities of these attacks? And then based on that, I developed the routes, really kind of focus on what the logical motivation is probably going to be for these offenders, and then determine the method of attack, right? And if we're, expecting the gun and we plan for the gun, that's all well and good, but then you're not really planning for the knife, right? Or for the possible someone running someone over in the parking lot. And so this is kind of in a nutshell what you would want to do when you're talking about risk, which is probability. We don't have someone who's already on a radar. That's a threat assessment. Risk assessment is probability that you're going to have one of these attacks, and you got to look at it more than just physical security and stats and things like this, and kind of keeping it, expand that net out a little bit and include, the type of offender, your likely, routes, likely types of attacks and things like that. And then you have a much better approach or way to try to, mitigate or even prevent these attacks. And the last thing I would say before I turn it over to you for your comments would be think like a predator. And then based on that, figure out what you need to do.
It's an interesting concept. We focus on school safety. We also work with businesses. When I think of a vulnerability assessment, it's all about your plan and your preparation, right? We can have the best systems in the world in our school. We can have all the cameras in the world in our school. We can have all the SROs we want in our school, or security officer, our business. In the same token, if we do not understand what we're looking for and limit ourselves by focusing on the specific instrument of violence, we are going to miss 99% of the people that are approaching our family, friends, children, fellow workers to harm them. Mm-hmm. We try to make this overly complicated, opposed to what causes people on a path to grievance and violence? How do we intercept that before they get there? And how do we just treat people like human beings? When we talk about being bullied, kids are bullied every day. And I'm going to be brutally honest. The public school system where I live, it's not something that's really focused on until parents get involved. Right. Teachers don't want to deal with it. It's a pain in their backside. They're worried that somebody's parents get mad. I mean, it's a whole array of just silliness going on. It is up to us as parents to teach our children to be good kids. It's up to the schools to hold people accountable to a level of discipline. It's also up to teachers to know when these potential things will happen and where they're going to happen. The playground, after school, before school, during recess, right? At the football game on Friday night, at the soccer game, at the basketball game, in the hallway between classes. So what are we going to do? What are we going to put in place? Active monitoring, active listening, active participation by teachers to ensure it doesn't happen. What if there's teachers in the hallway? There's no quiet places for kids to hide and do stuff. They're not going to do it, right? What if there's teachers at basketball games and football games walking around the stadium and the stands where people do stupid stuff under the bleachers, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a presence of authority, teachers, parents, school resource officers.
Sure.
This isn't hard. We know where the vulnerabilities are. We just need to be honest with ourselves as owners of businesses and school leaders that these are where these things typically happen. I'm going to put things in place there to make sure everybody knows we're watching, and you can't do that. It's no different than putting a camera on your house, right, outside. Hey, I got a camera and an alarm system sign in my front yard. So bad people know this is probably not an easy place to go mess around. It's no different.
Right. And people are lazy. They're going to move on.
100%.
They're not going to do something that's going to be a whole, very, complicated. They're going to take the easy, most vulnerable victim, and that's where they go.
Hallelujah. We don't lock our doors to protect our houses from criminals. We lock our doors to protect houses from people that are making bad choices.
That's right? Exactly right.
I mean, if the criminal wants to get in, he's going to get in. The bad person, he reaches the lock, and well, I'll go someplace else where the door's unlocked.
Yeah, and it's just like the when we're talking about the lockdown stuff. We've talked about this a lot before. What's the most effective thing for a lockdown? Having a lock that works and closing the door and locking it. Because what's going to happen is that every situation we've looked at in these case studies, the shooter moves on, and it's the ones that aren't locked, didn't close the door, or are outside of the room. They're the ones that get hurt.
It's a fact. Well, like my Meemaw used to say, I'm going to use Meemaw today. Meemaw said, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, son," and she's not wrong. So
that's exactly
let's get that
right.
prevention together.
Yep.
All right, Doc. Well, have a great weekend with your family. With that, this episode, Doc and Dave, we are out of here.
Have a great weekend. Thanks.